December 1817, inside a red brick mansion, standing at the very edge of London's center of power. There are no more banquets, no more lights burning through the night, no more carriages lining up along the Mall. On walls once covered with images of Britain's greatest military triumphs, time itself seems to hesitate. A man is dying, and at the same moment, a house is about to change hands. There is no ceremony, no trumpets, no official announcement, only a quiet shift that carries real danger. Marlborough House, a residence built to immortalize victory and authority, is about to pass out of the family that created it. What makes this moment unsettling is not the death of a duke. It is the question that follows. Why has a house born to glorify personal power survived so many reigns, so many political systems, so many changes of purpose, while other great mansions vanished from London's map? Why did they disappear? And Marlborough House did not. For more than 3 centuries, this building has witnessed what never appears in official records: decisions made after dinner, relationships concealed behind closed doors, moments when power changed hands, not through war, but through silence. If you think this is just the story of a building, you are mistaken. This is a story about power itself, how it is constructed, how it is punished, and how it is ultimately redefined. And to understand why Marlborough House still stands while an empire reshaped itself around it, we must travel back to the early 18th century, to a woman who inspired fear, loyalty, and resentment in equal measure. If you want to know who she was, and how she turned a house into something that outlived its age, stay with us. And if you're drawn to the hidden histories behind doors of power, remember to like and subscribe for the stories still waiting to be told. Sarah Jennings was born in 1660, at a moment when England was emerging from civil war and learning how to reconstruct power. She was not born into royalty, nor did she inherit vast wealth. Her family belonged to the lower ranks of the gentry, secure enough to survive, but easily forgettable in history without a decisive turning point. From an early age, Sarah displayed something rare for a woman of her time. She refused to accept a life lived behind the curtain, in a society where women were expected to serve as ornaments to male authority. Sarah sought to control that authority from within. Her opportunity came when she entered court life and formed a close relationship with Princess Anne, the woman who would later become queen. This was not a ceremonial friendship. Anne lived in isolation, uncertain of her own standing, overshadowed by her sister and often dismissed by the court. Sarah, by contrast, was decisive, confident, and instinctively aware of how to manage human emotion. Their correspondence reveals something unusual. They did not address each other by title. They used private names, not to conceal their bond, but to erase hierarchy on paper. In these letters, Anne often asked for guidance. Sarah responded with certainty. Gradually, emotional authority shifted. The future monarch began to seek direction from a woman without royal rank. This is the crucial point. Sarah did not need a throne. She controlled the person who sat upon it. In 1678, Sarah married John Churchill. At the time, he was a promising young officer with talent but little personal wealth. The marriage is often described as a love match, a rarity among the aristocracy. Yet it was also a perfect alliance of power. John carried military ambition. Sarah possessed political instinct. During the wars against Louis XIV of France, John Churchill rose rapidly. He did more than win battles. He maintained discipline, built fragile coalitions, and secured the loyalty of soldiers during campaigns that stretched across Europe. But battlefield success alone did not guarantee political power in London. That responsibility fell to Sarah. While John commanded troops in the Netherlands and Germany, Sarah remained at court. She managed her relationship with Anne, observing shifts in mood, moments of doubt, and episodes of hesitation. Appointments, funding, and titles did not appear by chance. They followed private conversations that never entered official records. The climax arrived in 1704 at the village of Blenheim in Bavaria. After hours of fighting, the Allied forces under John Churchill defeated the French and Bavarian armies, shattering Louis XIV's dominance on the continent. The Battle of Blenheim did more than save Vienna. It altered the balance of power across Europe. The consequences were immediate. John Churchill was elevated to Duke of Marlborough. Parliament granted enormous funds for the construction of Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, one of the largest private houses in England. The cost alone would equal hundreds of millions of pounds in modern terms. Yet, at the very moment when success seemed complete, Sarah was dissatisfied. Blenheim Palace was a national monument, financed by the state. It did not belong entirely to her. It stood far from the daily center of power she navigated. Sarah wanted something else. A house in London, close to court, close to political decision-making, and most importantly, a residence where every detail answered to her authority, not for display, not for convenience, but to assert a simple truth. The power of the Marlborough family did not exist only on the battlefield or in royal decrees. It existed in space, in architecture, and in the way others were compelled to enter her world. And when a woman has grown accustomed to shaping the will of a queen, the real question becomes unavoidable. What kind of space would she build to ensure that power never slipped from her grasp? In 1708, at the height of the Marlborough family's power, Queen Anne granted Sarah Churchill the right to use a parcel of Crown land directly adjacent to St. James's Palace. This was no ordinary piece of land. It stood beside the very center of royal authority, where every step carried political meaning. In a London where proximity to the court was among the highest privileges, the location alone spoke volumes. Sarah understood this perfectly. She did not ask for vast acreage. She chose a position that forced others to pass through her world. From the outset, the design brief was unusual. Sarah did not want a palace meant to overwhelm. Instead, she used a phrase that sounded modest, yet carried absolute authority. Strong, plain, convenient and good. Strength without excess. Restraint without weakness. Function without apology. The goal was not spectacle, but control. To realize this vision, Sarah turned to Christopher Wren, the most powerful architect in Britain at the time, the man who had completed St. Paul's Cathedral and reshaped London after the Great Fire of 1666. Wren was more than an architect. He embodied professional authority itself. Working alongside his son, he brought a classical architectural language based on balance and proportion, deliberately rejecting the flamboyant Baroque style fashionable across continental Europe. But from its earliest days, Marlborough House revealed that this would not be an ordinary commission. The bricks were not sourced in London. While commanding British forces in Europe, John Churchill arranged for Dutch bricks to be shipped back to England aboard returning military vessels, used as ballast. These bricks were harder, more durable, and carried a deep red tone. Among the lighter facades of St. James, Marlborough House immediately stood apart without relying on ornament. The stonework was entrusted to Edward Strong the Younger, a master craftsman who had worked on St. Paul's Cathedral. Strong was not a conventional mason. He represented the highest level of stone carving of the era. At Marlborough House, stone was not merely structural. It conveyed weight, permanence, and intention, creating the sense of entering a space designed to impose order. Then conflict emerged. Sarah refused to be a passive patron. She appeared on site frequently, intervened in details, questioned schedules, and demanded changes in construction methods. Wren's office, accustomed to unquestioned authority, found itself confronting a woman who would not yield. Contemporary accounts suggest the tension escalated until Sarah gradually sidelined Wren himself, choosing to work directly with contractors and craftsmen. In a male-dominated society, the act of diminishing the influence of the kingdom's most powerful architect was extraordinary. It was a political statement without words, and that decision changed everything. By 1711, Marlborough House was completed at a speed rare for a building of its scale. On the surface, it appeared as a restrained classical structure of 2 stories, carefully proportioned. Inside, however, the space was designed to shape human behavior. At its heart lay the Great Saloon, a near-cubic chamber rising through 2 floors. Covering its walls were monumental paintings by Louis Laguerre depicting the Battle of Blenheim. These were not decorative works. Victory was placed at eye level, confronting every visitor upon entry. There was no corridor to soften the impact, no space to retreat. Above, within a light-filled cupola, were paintings by Orazio Gentileschi and Artemisia Gentileschi, originally created for the Queen's house at Greenwich. Natural light poured down into the center of the room, merging with imagery of power and conflict. The effect was not beauty alone. It was surveillance. The paired staircases flanking the saloon were not simply aesthetic choices. They controlled movement. During crowded gatherings, guests ascended and descended in regulated flows. No pushing, no dominance. Order was enforced by space itself. Service areas were arranged with precision and restraint, efficient and discreet, never intruding upon the main rooms. Sarah, raised without extravagant excess, understood how power functioned behind the scenes. Everything had to operate smoothly, invisibly, without revealing chaos. Outside, the gardens followed strict geometric principles: straight paths, trimmed hedges, clear proportions. This was not a landscape for wandering. It was a continuation of control beyond the walls. By this point, Marlborough House had fulfilled its purpose. It was not a residence. It was a system of authority built from brick, stone, light, and movement. But this is where the story turns. Because when a building is created to control others, it inevitably attracts the attention of those who wish to seize control in return. And what happens when Marlborough House, the personal power symbol of Sarah Churchill, becomes the target of one of the most subtle political acts of revenge in early 18th century London? By the early 1710s, cracks began to appear in the power Sarah Churchill had so carefully constructed, cracks she could no longer fully control. the once intimate relationship between Sarah and Queen Anne gradually grew strained. Anne, now firmly seated on the throne, was no longer the isolated princess of earlier years. She began to feel constrained, increasingly aware of how deeply her decisions had been shaped by a companion who had grown accustomed to deciding on her behalf. The affectionate letters became fewer, private conversations shortened, cooled. Then the rupture came. Sarah was removed from key positions at court. There was no public announcement, no formal sentence, but access to the Queen, the single greatest source of her authority, was quietly severed. In early 18th century politics, this was equivalent to exile. At the same time, John Churchill was no longer the man of uninterrupted victories. He began to suffer strokes, his health visibly declining. The general who had once commanded tens of thousands of troops appeared less frequently in both political and military life. The Marlborough axis of power weakened from both directions. The vacuum did not remain empty for long. Robert Walpole rose to prominence. Born into the landed gentry, rather than ancient nobility, Walpole embodied a new kind of power, parliamentary power, power built on finance, influence, and the ability to manipulate institutions from within. In time, he would be regarded as Britain's first de facto prime minister. Walpole and Sarah had clashed repeatedly over political matters. Neither forgot, neither forgave. But Walpole did not strike openly. He chose a subtler weapon. Around 1727, Walpole quietly purchased the parcel of land lying between Marlborough House and Pall Mall to London's ruling class. Pall Mall was not merely a street. It was one of the city's most prestigious arteries, a daily passage for politicians, aristocrats, and figures of influence. Direct access to Pall Mall meant visibility, recognition, and centrality within elite society. That single transaction changed everything. The grand entrance Christopher Wren had originally envisioned for Marlborough House was permanently blocked. The stone gateway and screen already constructed became useless. Instead of opening onto a ceremonial approach, they were reduced to a decorative grotto in the courtyard. A structure designed for prominence was demoted to ornament. No document recorded this as punishment. Yet the message was unmistakable. Each time Sarah looked upon that gate, she confronted a reminder. Her power had been circumscribed, not by law, not by force, but by property. Sarah refused to accept the humiliation in silence. In 1729, she leased 4 houses to the west of Marlborough House and ordered them demolished, creating an alternative entrance toward Pall Mall. The cost of resistance, however, was evident. The new approach was narrow, angled, awkward. It functioned, but only just. There was no grandeur, no sense of command. Every carriage that struggled through that entrance replayed the same lesson. Marlborough House still stood, but it now existed under constraint. Sarah Churchill lived until 1744. Reaching the age of 84, she continued to control vast estates, to manage her finances, to pursue lawsuits that dragged on for years. Yet the political world she had once shaped no longer operated by her rules. The woman who built Marlborough House as an instrument of control had lost control of the game itself. And when the architect of that system finally disappeared, the real question emerged. How would Marlborough House continue to exist once the hand that created it was gone. By the second half of the 18th century, Marlborough House entered a new phase, quieter in appearance, yet no less consequential. After Sarah Churchill's death in 1744, the house ceased to function as a direct instrument of personal power. It became an inherited aristocratic residence, used as a conventional London townhouse by successive dukes. But aristocratic power itself was changing form. In the 1772, a later Duke of Marlborough chose to modernize the house to suit new tastes and expectations among Britain's elite. The task was entrusted to William Chambers, one of the leading architects of the Georgian era, best known for Somerset House and trained in the classical traditions of continental Europe. Chambers added a third story to Marlborough House, expanding its living and reception spaces. This was not an erasure of the past, but a recalibration. The original classical proportions were respected, yet the building now stood taller, heavier, and unmistakably Georgian, reflecting the confidence of Britain's ruling class in the decades following European conflict. Marlborough House endured, but its function had shifted. It was no longer a center of personal authority. It had become an asset, ready to be transferred. The true turning point came in 1817. That year, the fourth Duke of Marlborough died. Almost simultaneously, the Crown moved to purchase Marlborough House. This was not an act of sentiment. It was a strategic decision. The court required a suitable London residence for Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate heir to the British throne, and her husband, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Charlotte was the great hope of the dynasty. Young, widely beloved, and seen as the stabilizing future of the monarchy after the uncertainty of the Regency years. Marlborough House, positioned beside St. James's Palace, was considered the ideal setting for a young royal couple. Then tragedy intervened. In November 1817, Princess Charlotte died during childbirth. Her infant did not survive. Britain was plunged into genuine national shock. This was not merely a royal death. It was the collapse of an expected future. The succession suddenly became uncertain. A house prepared for the beginning of a new reign was instantly transformed into a place of mourning. Prince Leopold moved into Marlborough House alone, a young widower living inside a mansion built for celebration, power, and social display. Rooms designed to hold crowds now echoed with absence. There were no banquets, no welcoming ceremonies, only years of solitude. Leopold remained at Marlborough House for more than a decade, and within those walls, in 1831, he received an offer that would change his life. He was invited to become king of a newly created state, the Kingdom of Belgium, recently separated from the Netherlands. He left London carrying memories tied more closely to loss than to triumph. Yet Marlborough House itself was not finished. During the 1822, as London underwent aggressive redevelopment, serious proposals emerged to demolish Marlborough House and replace it with a terrace similar to Carlton House Terrace. These plans were not theoretical. They appeared on contemporary maps, including London maps published in 1830. The possibility of erasing Marlborough House was real, and then, somehow, it did not happen. There was no official explanation, no single decision preserved in the record. But Marlborough House remained standing amid a rapidly transforming city, as though it had begun to assume a different role, one not yet fully defined, and that leads to the next, unavoidable question: why did Marlborough House survive, while so many other power-laden mansions of its era disappeared? When Marlborough House ceased to be a place where power was generated, it began to assume a different role. No longer an instrument of political control, the building gradually became a refuge for power in retreat, sheltering memory, ritual, and private life in the years after the throne. In 1831, Marlborough House received a new resident, Queen Adelaide, widow of William IV. Adelaide came from a small German duchy, raised in strict religious discipline and known for a life of restraint and moral seriousness. She did not bring a noisy court with her, nor did she arrive with ambitions to remodel or display authority. For nearly 2 decades, from 1831 to 1849, Marlborough House under Adelaide became a place of quiet. There were no grand banquets, no major alterations. Rooms that once echoed with music were devoted instead to prayer, reading, and charitable work. Power did not vanish, but it contracted, taking the form of moral discipline rather than political influence. When Adelaide died in 1849, Marlborough House once again stood empty, and then, unexpectedly, the story turned. From 1852, as Britain entered a period of rapid industrial expansion, Marlborough House was repurposed as the Museum of Manufactures. Rooms that had once celebrated military triumphs now displayed textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and industrial design. Authority no longer resided in lineage or ceremony, but in skill, production, and innovation. Between 1853 and 1861, the building served as the National Art Training School, the precursor of the Royal College of Art. Students learned design and fine arts inside spaces once reserved for elite power. Marlborough House, built to control others, now shaped minds for a transforming society. But this still was not the end. In 1861, everything changed abruptly. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, married Princess Alexandra of Denmark. Britain required a new social center for its future king. Marlborough House was chosen, and with that decision came extensive transformation. Sir James Pennethorne, an architect responsible for numerous royal projects, was commissioned to extend Marlborough House to the north. The building did not merely grow larger, it became prepared for an entirely different kind of royal life. For the next 4 decades, Marlborough House stood at the heart of London's social world. The term Marlborough House set entered public language, referring to the inner circle of the Prince of Wales. This was not simply the traditional aristocracy. It included newly wealthy industrialists, stage actresses, and figures of controversial reputation. 12-course dinners stretched late into the night. French wines, champagne, and baccarat games were played for sums large enough to purchase a respectable middle-class home of the era. The climax came in 1891 with the baccarat scandal, when the Prince of Wales was drawn into a court case involving accusations of cheating at cards. Royal respectability wavered, yet Marlborough House remained the hub of informal power and influence. Behind the glitter, Edward's extramarital relationships with Lily, Langtry, and Alice Keppel unfolded with little concealment. Alexandra, increasingly deaf, continued to appear beside her husband at public events, maintaining royal dignity amid private contradiction. It was here, at Marlborough House in 1865, that Alexandra gave birth to their second son, George. That child would later become King George V, the monarch who would lead Britain through the First World War. A king born not in a formal palace, but at the center of a social world marked by scandal. When Queen Victoria died in 1901 and Edward ascended the throne, Marlborough House changed hands once more. Edward and Alexandra moved to Buckingham Palace, yet the building's association with royal widows was far from over. In 1910, following Edward VI's death, Queen Alexandra returned to Marlborough House, now in her 60s and nearly deaf. She lived surrounded by memories of 4 decades past. The house, once again, became a place of recollection rather than authority. Alexandra maintained a small cemetery for her beloved dogs within the grounds, a detail that appears personal, yet reveals much. As political power receded, emotional attachment moved to the foreground of life. Alexandra died in 1925, closing a long chapter tied to Marlborough House between 1926 and 1932. A memorial fountain was constructed within the grounds to honor her memory, not a monument of conquest, but a marker of remembrance. Still, Marlborough House had not finished its journey. In 1936, Queen Mary, widow of George V, returned to live there. Born into a less wealthy branch of royalty, Mary was rigorously educated and known for her passion for collecting. She brought with her vast quantities of art, antiques, and historical objects, transforming Marlborough House into something close to a private museum. In the garden, a rotating summer house was built, capable of turning with the sun. A small detail, yet one that revealed how Marlborough House now served personal comfort rather than national ceremony. Mary lived to witness one of the defining crises of the 20th century. In 1936, her son Edward V abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson. Royal authority shifted once again, this time not through death, but through personal choice. She survived to see George V crowned, to live through the Second World War, and to witness the accession of her granddaughter, Elizabeth II, in 1952. Queen Mary died in 1953, only months before Elizabeth's coronation. With her death, an era ended. Marlborough House was no longer a residence for rising power. It had become a home for those who remained after power had passed. And that reality leads to the final question of this story. What happens to Marlborough House when even the widowed queens no longer return? After 1953, following the death of Queen Mary, Marlborough House ceased to be a royal residence. The rooms that had once witnessed power rising, collapsing, and returning in the form of memory suddenly became empty in a different way. There was no throne, no widowed queen, no longer any banquets or ceremonies tied to monarchy, yet the building was not abandoned. In 1965, Queen Elizabeth II made a decision rich in symbolism. Marlborough House was leased to the Commonwealth Secretariat as its headquarters. A house built to celebrate military victory and imperial authority was now repurposed as the center of a voluntary association of independent nations, many of them former colonies, meeting not under command, but by choice. Not long before that, within Marlborough House itself, the Gambia Independence Act was signed, a document ending British rule in West Africa, signed beneath the Blenheim paintings that once glorified Britain's military triumphs in Europe. Nothing was torn down, nothing erased. A new meaning was simply layered over the old. From that moment on, Marlborough House became a post-imperial symbol in its own quiet way. not a museum, not a ruin, but a living space, still in use, still adapting. Today, the building is listed as Grade I, the highest level of heritage protection in the United Kingdom. Each September, during open house, doors usually associated with discreet diplomacy are opened to the public. Visitors enter not only to admire architecture, but to stand among overlapping layers of history and to feel how power shifts across time. Seen as a whole, Marlborough House has never been loyal to a single form of power. It was once an instrument of personal ambition, then a stage for monarchy, then a refuge for memory, and now a space for dialogue among post-colonial nations. Perhaps that is what Sarah Churchill created without fully intending to. She built a house for power, but it was adaptability that allowed Marlborough House to outlive every regime that passed through it, and the remaining question is not for history, but for the present. As power, wealth, and global influence continue to change shape, which buildings of our own time will still stand? And how will they be redefined? If you wish to continue exploring spaces where power was created, lost, and transformed in unexpected ways, the next videos on screen will take you deeper into stories even more complex than this one. Thank you for staying to the very end. If you find these hidden histories behind power worth reflecting on, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your perspective. Until next time,